So that's kind of what he wanted to say. And I'm going to turn it over to Benson.
Well, thank you very much. And let me say, I'm pleased to be here and have a chance to talk about canoes, which is always fun. And I also want to apologize if anyone has another favorite canoe capital that they are interested in. I suspect if you get in touch with Keith, he'd be more than happy to set up equal time so you can talk about some of the other fine canoes that are out there. But the one that I'm interested in and feel I know a little bit about is Old Town, Maine. And so the obvious question is, well, why did Old Town turn out to be such a focus for canoes? And the really short answer is because they've been building them there for about 10,000 years. That there's been a Native American tribe at this location, hence the name of the town, for quite a while. And as shown from the mid 1800s here, they were building canoes even then. And the reason they're there is that there's a section of the river, getting ahead of myself here, that there's a section of the river that's very rocky, and Penobscot is actually roughly translates as the rocky place or the stony place. And so that was an area where they would, the fish who were running, the salmon, the shad, the sea run fish that would come up the river to spawn were particularly easy to catch. And so that's the reason that a hunter-gatherer group could get together in fairly large numbers, is that their food supply was pretty well taken care of. And of course, when the Europeans came along, they liked the falls for catching fish, but they were particularly interested because it was an abundant power source, and in particular for sawing logs and making lumber. And so in the mid 1800s, this was, they ran a lot of logs down the river and into the mills. And they actually built one of the first railroads in the country to connect Old Town to Bangor, where they could load them on seagoing ships. And so Bangor was the lumber capital of the world for much of that period. And then by the late 1800s, canoes have become a huge fad. And the areas like this, Auburndale outside of Boston, were hugely popular with canoes. In fact, if you think of the popularity today of golf and skiing combined, well, that's how popular canoes were in that era. And it was said that you could walk completely across the Charles River without getting your feet wet just by stepping from one canoe to another, as you can probably see in this. So, of course, with this huge demand for canoes, there were a number of businesses that started in the Penobscot River area. There was Evan Garish in Bangor, is said to be the first, the pioneer manufacturer of canvas canoes, as his catalog advertised. But of course, Bert Morris in Vesey, Guy Carlton was a bateau builder from Old Town who got into it fairly early on. And of course, Ed White was freely admitted that he copied a garish design when he was starting in the canoe business. And so there were quite a number of people out doing it, and it was a huge business. And right in the middle of all of this, a guy named George Gray was running a hardware store in Old Town. He's shown here on the left. And the story goes that, that the gentleman shown here on the left, who was approached him named Alfred Wickett, and he approached him looking for work. And George said, well, what can you do? And he said, well, I can make canoes. And so George decided to set him up and start making canoes behind the hardware store. And he very quickly, as the business grew, brought in the gentleman on the right, who is Richard or Dick Wickett, who is his brother. And he learned the business and actually got lured away in 1906 to go run the Chestnut Canoe Company in Fredericton, which he did for many years. And business boomed. They quickly outgrew the shop behind the hardware store, and so they bought an old shoe factory on Middle Street and called themselves the Indian Old Town Canoe Company and painted it across the front of the building, as shown in this picture. And they were actually doing well enough that when the Ziegler Polar Expedition wanted somebody to make custom canoes for them that could be taken apart in sections and loaded on dog sleds for their run to the North Pole. They approached Old Town, and they actually had some pictures of them shown here. And unfortunately, they didn't make it to the pole, but as near as I can tell, they probably were saved, because when their ship became icebound and they had to escape to an outer island where a rescue ship could meet them, they probably used this canoe to get there. So another name that's worth mentioning, and was clearly a part of it in the early days, is Joseph Ranko. He's shown here on the right in his question from, I can't hear you, let me unmute.
I'm sorry, I accidentally killed the projector. If you could hold for just a minute while I get
Sure.
back up. Thank you. You need to let me back in the meeting, go to the waiting room.
Okay. Got a couple of people waiting.
Okay, we're back in. Thank you.
Sure. And had a comment that how canoodling became popular as well, but that's another story. But at any rate, Joe Ranko was actually one of the very early builders. His obituary claimed that he was the first person to use canvas instead of bark on a canoe, although there's some question as to whether there might be other people who can make that claim. And this picture on the left is what I believe to be Joe Ranko leaning on the steps of the canoe company. I've shown it to both of his grandchildren, and they aren't really sure. They don't have a whole lot of pictures of him, but the one on the right is definitely him. And he was clearly a master builder who was involved. And then after a year as the Indian Old Town Canoe Company, they reincorporated and started working with John Robertson from the Massachusetts area. Now, J.R. Robertson was well known. He grew up in Peterborough. He worked with Rushton in New York, and at this time he was running his own livery and canoe shop and building business in Auburndale. But they got together and renamed it the Robertson and Old Town Canoe Company and published a catalog with this picture inside it. But I'm not sure they actually painted his name on the front of the building. If you look carefully, the font in Robertson is a little bit different from the perspective on the Old Town Canoe Company. And so my guess is that they may have just airbrushed the photo to make it look like they did. And unfortunately, that didn't work out for some reason. And so a year later, they changed the name again to be just the Old Town Canoe Company. And it looks like they didn't want to repaint the whole name on the front of the factory, so they just made it Old Town Canoe CO, and it was still more or less centered on the building. But things were really starting to pick up at this point. And that was when George, shown here in the upper right of the steps, decided that to let his son, Sam, on the lower left corner here, take a run at it. Now, Sam was only 2 years out of college at this point. He was probably pretty green, and you can tell it was a pretty rowdy crowd that he's working with, but he decided to take it on. And so away they went. And they made some pretty big canoes, like this 34-foot war canoe, as it was known, introduced in 1906. And they also made some pretty small canoes, like this 4-foot model that you see. Now, these are pretty popular in the auction market today. The auctioneers like to call them salesman samples. And I think that's a bit of a misnomer, that there's no evidence that salesmen actually took these around, but there is a lot of evidence that they were used as a dealer incentive. Because at that time, most of the shipping of canoes was done by rail. And canoes were pretty big, they're awkward, they get dropped, they get stuff stacked on top of them. And so frequently they'd get damaged in shipment, and that didn't go well. The customer would refuse it, the railroad would have to ship it back, the factory would have to repair it, nobody was happy. So the idea was that if you could fill a complete railroad car full of canoes, which is about 40 to 50 canoes, depending on the mix of lengths. Close the door in Old Town, Maine, ship it all the way to the destination, open the door, you were pretty well guaranteed that you weren't going to have any damage in shipment. And so the incentive for the dealer was that if they would order a complete railroad car full of canoes, then the factory would include a 4-foot model. And they could use that as a display. They could send it to their, give it to their kids to play with, as shown in the previous photo. They could do whatever they wanted with it. And if you bought 2 railroad cars, then you had your choice of either 1 8-foot canoe or 2 4-foot canoes. And so there are quite a number of them around today, and some of them have done quite handsomely in the market. Now, of course, when some of these small sporting goods shops would get a load of 50 canoes, they typically have a storage problem. And some of them would be piling them outside in the street, as you can see here. But canoes were popular, and so they could typically move them along pretty quickly or find other storage options. And things were going very well. By March of 1910, Sam and Old Town were doing well enough that they actually bought out the Carlton Canoe Company. And this was a big win for them, because of course it meant now they could have 2 different names, 2 different brands that they could sell. And so if Macy's was selling Old Town canoes on one corner in New York City, and Gimbel's or Abercrombie and Fitch were just up the street and wanted to sell canoes, they could sell them Carltons, and technically they weren't competing with one another. But the real win, the thing that got Sam most excited, was that Carlton also owned a sawmill, shown here on the right. And so this guaranteed his primary source of raw material. That Carlton had timber rights, he had the mill, that Sam was pretty well assured that he wasn't going to run out of wood, which had been a problem in the early days in particular. And so things went along well until disaster struck about a year later, when the mill burned flat. And mercifully, it was insured, and so they started right to work and rebuilt it. But it meant that after that date, all Carltons were consolidated, all Carlton construction was consolidated into the factory at Old Town. And so this is something that's going to be looked at a lot more this summer when the WCHA holds their assembly at Paul Smith's. They're focusing on Carlton canoes. And so it should be hopefully a chance to see a lot of ones. And they did continue making both Carlton and Carlton as a separate brand up into the 40s. But the factory where they were doing all of this was fairly sizable. This artist conception from the 1920 catalog claimed a floor space of 150,000 square feet, nearly 600 feet long. And it was certainly a big factory, and they were pushing through a lot of canoes. Like many artist conceptions, the reality was a little different. It was not quite as pretty, squeezed in between the coal yard and the fire station, but they were pushing a lot of canoes through at that point. And by the mid-20s, the market had started to change a little bit, as shown on this catalog cover. That the outboard motor was definitely having an impact, shown here for the first time on the cover. And so canoes were starting to decline, and there was a lot of interest. The hot new thing were boats with transoms. And so Old Town was adapting to that. The other change in the market is acknowledged by the car in the back of the photo. Cars were making a pretty big impact on the canoe business at that stage, because prior to that, if you went canoeing, you either did it typically at a canoe club, where there were always a couple of dock boys to help carry the canoe around, or you went off on some camping trip somewhere where you typically hired guides. So while the sports were out hunting or fishing or just communing with nature, it was the guides who were portaging the canoes and doing the heavy lifting. But suddenly, when the car arrived, now the sports are lifting their own canoes, and suddenly weight became a very important factor. And so you see a lot of lightweight canoes being introduced at this period, shorter canoes, pack canoes, a lot of changes in the industry. And of course, the Great Depression was a bit of a disaster for everybody in the canoe industry. But by the late 40s and 50s, things are coming back, but everybody wanted boats with motors at that point. And so Old Town went along. They made motorboats in a variety of different types like this. And by the time you got to the early 60s, the boats were getting bigger, the motors were getting bigger, things were really booming. And then in the space of about 2 years, the entire wooden boat market collapsed. Nobody wanted a wooden boat anymore. They all wanted fiberglass boats. And so Old Town tried to go along. They built a line of fiberglass boats, but they hadn't completely forgotten their roots. They'd worked a lot with Bud King, who'd come over from White to get him into the fiberglass business. They made fiberglass canoes. And of course, it didn't stop with fiberglass. By the time you get into the 70s, anybody who was paddling in the 70s has probably seen some version of this advertisement saying, when we threw our tripper off the factory roof, we learned 2 things. 1, it won't fly, and 2, it's the toughest canoe we ever made. And it actually is quite difficult to throw a canoe off a 4-story building and get it to land on end. So they actually spent the better part of an afternoon carrying it up to the top, throwing it off, trying to get it to land right. And they went through a lot of film in the process. So when it came time to put the advertisement together, they took the best picture throwing, the best picture falling, and of course the one where it landed on end that they wanted, and put them all together. But if you look closely at the shadow lines on the windows, you'll see that these are all different pictures, different times, different throws, because as I said, it's actually a challenge. But this also, of course, in the October of 1973, when the Arabs implemented the first oil embargo, that was a huge boon for the canoe industry. Suddenly, nobody wanted a motorboat. Everybody wanted to go back to nature in a canoe or some other human-powered craft. And so their business boomed again, and things kept going. Then by the mid-'80s, Old Town bought White Canoe, and was the last consolidation of the old line canoe businesses in Old Town. And it's always interested me that when companies merge, the people in the company that is being purchased always describe it as a merger. The people who are in the company that paid for it always describe it as a purchase. But nonetheless, they went together. And of course, things didn't stop there. By the time you get into the 90s and up to the current day, of course, kayaks are a big part of the business. And so Old Town has responded to that, particularly the fishing kayak market. But this is the White Rose Canoe Company, and so we won't dwell on kayaks here. But I guess with that, I will pause and say, are there any questions? I see that the chat has a bunch of them. So
yeah,
let's, Keith, do you want to?
Benson, can you do me 2 favors? Can you check the waiting room to see if there's other folks who need to come?
Oh, yes, I see we have 2 in the waiting room, and they've just come. And let me make you, do you want me to make the White Rose Canoe the host?
Yes, please.
Okay. And you were the host again.
Okay, great.
And so do you have any questions from the floor? I suppose is probably the best place to start.
Feel free, and if Benson can hear me, he pretty much can hear you too. So any questions? Benson? Nothing. Okay. Not from the room at the moment.
No free. Okay, let me get the chat questions up here. And
that was mostly back and forth with a couple.
Right. Looks like we had a question about Robertson screws.
Yeah.
I'm a canoe guy, not a screw guy. So I don't believe there's a connection with Robertson screws. I know they're really popular in Canada, but I don't believe that J.R. Robertson gets credit for the Robertson screw. Talking about canoodling, and yes, that was a big part of the popularity of canoes, is that was an era when typically if young people wanted to get together unchaperoned, a canoe was one of the few places where they were allowed to do that. And so needless to say, canoeing became very popular. By the 20s, the car sort of supplanted the canoe in that role. And question about shipping. Oh yeah, still works with trucks.
Yeah.
Although I don't think they're giving away model canoes anymore. And comment that Novacraft replicated this for their Tough Stuff commercials. Yeah, there was also a Wooden Canoe Company in Michigan that replicated. They only did it out the second floor with a wooden canoe, but there have been a number of people who've tried this. And is there a market today for a 1917 Old Town HW 17 foot? And the answer is absolutely. So it may not be as much as you think it's worth, but that's a whole nother discussion. But yes, there's definitely a market for canoes. Actually, one of the interesting analyses that I undertook recently is a common question was, well, how many canoes were made? And the short answer is it looks like there were about 500,000 wooden canoes that were made by everybody in the industry, Old Town and all the others. Old Town was probably about 40% of that, but there were quite a few made by other people as well. And it also looks like canoes have about a 2% survival rate, wooden canoes anyway, which means in round numbers, there are probably 11,000 canoes out there. So for the roughly 1,000 to 2,000 people in the WCHA and others who are interested in it, I think they're more than enough to go around. So as a buyer, that means that the good news is that there are probably enough canoes so that the demand, of course, the ones that everybody wants are always going to be priced high, but there are going to be some. So unless I'm missing something, that should be most of the questions.
There's a question about any details on the oldest known surviving Old Town today.
Yes. Oh, there it is. Okay. Yes. That would be, and there's one known Indian Old Town canoe. It dates from circa 1901, because that's the only time they were calling it that. And there is information about it on the WCHA website. If you search for Indian Old Town Canoe 1901 in the title, you'll find it. And it's an interesting old boat, needless to say. But there are very few. Unfortunately, the serial number records didn't start till about October of 1905, when Sam started. They were keeping some records before that, but those have not been preserved.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of canoes with low serial numbers that look like Old Towns that might be. A lot, meaning you could probably a score or a few score, but there are really only 3 documented Old Towns from before October of 1905, and the Indian Old Town is the only one.
Yeah, Benson, can you spend a minute talking about the record keeping with Old Town? I was really surprised to find that the amount of detail that was available.
There actually is a lot of detail. I probably can't pull it up easily, but yes, they had basically 5 by 7 inch cards that were started, as I said, in October of 1905 to record the details of canoes. And of course, this was an era when things were done on piecework. And so they wanted to have a lot of information about, what was done and when. Also from a quality control point of view, that if they were always trying new things, and if something didn't work, it was always nice to be able to go back and say, oh, well, this is what happened, or this is why. And they continued that right up until 1995. And that's when they switched to an all electronic system. But what that means is that if you have an Old Town canoe, if you look on the inside stem, which is that curved piece of wood that defines the end of the canoe, and you look on the floor on the inside under the deck area, you could probably find typically a 4 to 6 digit number, followed by a space, followed by a 2-digit number that's the length in feet. And so if you take that number and you post it on the WCHA site, or then a volunteer can answer your request with the original build record. And you can see where it was shipped, how it was made, what woods were used in it. You know, there's a lot of good detail in that. Of course, the detail changed over time, but it can be really handy. And this even applies to some of the models. The little 4-foot models were also occasionally numbered. Now, often you may not get as much detail as you like, that it often would be shipped to a dealer. And so you may not necessarily see your grandmother's name or grandfather's name on it if it was shipped to a dealer in their area, but some were shipped direct. And there also is often information on the back. If it came back to the factory for repairs, there'll be detail on that as well. So the short summary, and yes, Kim has just posted the connection on the woodencanoe.org or wcha.org are the two websites that the WCHA maintains. There's also a question about where would somebody advertise an old canoe? Of course, you know, there are all kinds of places. There's Craigslist, there are local newspapers and things like that. My experience, one of the fastest ways to find a good new home for an old canoe is an advertisement on the WCHA site, because that has been around for a while, and it tends to be where the places where people go looking when they're looking for a canoe. And so that's usually a good place to start. It's free to members of the WCHA, and I think it's a $35 fee if you have a canoe you want to list and you're not a member. So let's see.
There was a question earlier from Tom about when did Johnson Outdoors take over, and was this a hostile takeover?
It was not a hostile takeover. No, the company was doing well in 1974, and so they came in and bought it at the end of 1974. And Dean Gray continued to run it until 1978, and then he retired. And that then by the 80s, they were all off on their own, and they've been running it since. So, but no, it was not a hot. There had been other offers on the company for the company before, but this was a particularly generous one, and it was. So the decision was made to let them have it.
Last one. Oh, I'm sorry. You had one.
Yeah, did Old Town ever market a sailing canoe?
Yes, Old Town had sailing canoes. I'd have to look at the exact date, but there's actually a thread there's a forum for the Wooden Canoe Heritage Association, and there's a thread there called The Evolution of Sailing Canoes, and it traces the changes in the sailing canoes over the years. And so they, as I said, they started, I'm guessing, around 1910, and they continued to have sailing canoes, both wooden and then fiberglass, right up through the 70s, and I think into the 80s. In the 20s, they even had some special sailing canoes with a 16-pound bronze centerboard mounted through the hull, and they were the real hot thing for a while. And they're a hoot to sail. So the short answer is yes. They had a number of sailing canoes, and sailing canoes were really popular for a while. The story goes that if you wanted to go sailing and you couldn't afford a fancy yacht, well, almost anybody could afford a canoe in the first half of the 1900s. And if you put a sail on it, you could have a great time. And so they were the poor man's yacht, if you will. And recognize this was an era before lasers, before the sunfish. You know, there weren't a lot of other options at that point. But they used to have huge races down in New York City. You know, they'd have literally hundreds of sailing canoes at a time down off Long Island, sailing in races and such. So it was a big thing.
Benson, will you have your boats at the Maine Canoe Symposium this year?
Hopefully, is the short summary. For years, I used to run a sailing program at the Maine Canoe Symposium, and they've moved to a new venue now. And one of the things that we need to get sorted out is that, unfortunately, people do occasionally tip over sailing canoes. And since typically that was run in fairly early June, hypothermia was a real concern. So we need to make arrangements so that we can have a rescue boat. That was when we were back at Winona, that was available. We haven't sorted all those details out at the new location. But assuming we can get that sorted out, then we'll probably have sailing again. Or if we don't, then we may just do a land presentation and talk about it as opposed to doing it.
Okay. And just, I don't know if people can see, but this is one of those data sheets.
Yeah, if you go to, again, if you go to the Wooden Canoe Heritage Association forum, there's a whole section on serial number research, and there are lots of examples there that you can find and hear about. And obviously, if you have a number, send it in, and we'll have, as I said, can probably get you a build record for it most of the time.
Okay.
Like any record keeping systems, there are some misfiles, there are some lost records. So occasionally we can't find something. And the other struggle is that although they continue to keep records up until 1995, the WCHA paid to have those records scanned, which is the reason we can respond with them. But they only scanned up to about 250,000, which is in the mid 80s. So if you have a really new one, it may not have been scanned. Okay. But that's because obviously most of the boats by the 80s were plastic boats, not wooden boats. So a different market.
Tom has an additional question. Did Old Town always use the diamond seat bolts?
No, the diamond headed bolts that they're known for were actually first introduced in the early 20s, I think about 1922, 1923 era. And they actually have, there have been a number of changes over the years. In the Second World War, they of course couldn't get brass. It was all being used for shell casings. So their boats from that era have diamond head bolts, but they're in galvanized steel, not in brass. And then in the 70s, they ran out again and decided not to do it. So there are a number of canoes from that era that have slotted screws. And then they got some back by the 80s. And my understanding is that Jerry at Island Falls and Rollin at Northwoods Canoe have run out of them again. And so it's not clear whether they're going to be able to get another batch or if people are going to have to start scavenging hardware from old canoes. There was a story years ago of someone who brought a canoe from the 40s into the factory for repairs in like the 70s or sometime. And so the guy doing the repairs thought he was doing a big favor. He said, "Oh, I'm going to take all these old steel bolts out and put nice new brass ones in." When the guy picked it up, he was horrified. He said, "No, that's part of the character of the canoe. I wanted." So they had to go scurry around and find some of the old steel ones that were in the back stock room and replace them for him so he could have his period correct canoe back. So,
Great. Did Old Town have their name or decals on the early canoes? This is from
no, the decals did not appear. The side, well, the short answer is that there were decals on the decks of the Robertson and Old Town and early Old Town canoes. There are actually a couple of versions of it. The Indian Old Town canoes had a brass plate that was often nickel coated. And in 1906 is when they went to the current version of the decal on the deck. And that went through a couple of changes. There's the older ones have black bars, newer ones have red bars, some have red bars with gold letters. And the side decals actually came in from the boat. When motorboats in the 40s and 50s started to get popular, it was toward the end of the 50s that they started putting the side decals on the canoes. So the answer is no, the side decals were not on the early canoes. And that's one of the things that always sort of annoys me, is to see this very old canoe with a very modern decal on it. It's sort of like, no, that doesn't look right to me. But as the story goes, it's your canoe, do whatever you want with it. So.
Any other questions from anyone?
Yes.
Go ahead.
What's the status of Old Town today as far as wooden canoes and their restoration shop?
Old Town is only doing plastic today at the factory in Old Town. They have subcontracted with Jerry Stelmach at Island Falls Canoes to build their canoes. He's also selling repair parts, you know, if you want them. And again, if you go to the WCHA site, there are a host of people who are, or a large collection of people who are doing restorations. And typically you can find one, if not in your state, at least nearby. Obviously, they're more in the east than there are in the west, but they're not. So the short answer is yes, they're still building Old Town canoes, but they're on the original forms, but Jerry's doing it. It's not being done at the factory. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Great.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Oh, cool. Any other questions from anyone? Type in the chat or unmute yourself and feel free to speak up. You'll be able to do that, I believe, now.
Jerry did end up with the Old Town molds, didn't he?
Jerry did end up with the Old Town molds?
Oh,
Yes.
Yes.
Not all of the forms have been preserved. I mean, Jerry's storage space and Old Town storage space is limited. And so, for example, if you're looking for an 18-foot HW form, well, that went away in the 50s. He doesn't have that anymore. So he has most of the popular forms, obviously all the forms for the ones, he has his own website that you can go to where he lists the ones he builds. And he'll build them in various grades. I mean, if you want an all mahogany one in AA grade, or you want you know, CS grade is fine. He'll do that. I mean, most of these things were customized. As the story goes, most canoe builders were happy to build anything that the customer wanted to pay for, and so you can get customized boats. But yes, he does have most of the forms, and if he doesn't have the exact one you're looking for, I suspect he can probably do it. And again, there are lots of other people who are building, you know, either their own canoes or variations on them, so that it's actually fairly encouraging. Because when I was little, a lot of people were bemoaning the loss of wood canoes with all the plastics coming in and the craftsmanship. And the irony is that today there are actually more canoe builders out there than there were in the 60s. And now, most of them are small. They're building very specialized boats. They're gorgeous pieces of art, so that they aren't necessarily priced quite as economically as some of the earlier ones. But there are actually some really nice canoes being made today by a variety of people. And Jerry is certainly a master builder. I mean, he knows that game.
Murad is asking, do you have a favorite hull design or model?
Well, I will admit to some bias that I like Old Town canoes, all of them. The Molitor is a particularly interesting one to me. I guess that's probably, I have two of those. That's the only one I've duplicated. So I have one from the 20s and I have one from the 80s. But frankly, I'm getting older. I like the lightweight canoes too. They're what used to be called their 50-pound series. And those are a sweet little canoe, often compared, it's probably more familiar with like the Bob Special and some of the chestnut things. But you know, I'm reaching the age where small lightweight canoes are a lot more popular than canoes that exceed 100 pounds. So, well, I guess if there aren't any others, I mean, certainly someone has questions, don't hesitate to reach out. You can usually find me on the WCHA forum or other places. And thank you very much for your time and your patience. And I look forward to all the other interesting things that White Rose Canoe is going to have. So I guess I'll turn it over to you, Keith.
All right. And thanks for that lead in. I was trying to figure out a way to bring that up, but we've got 3 more of these sessions. February the 16th, they're all on the third Thursday. The next one is, I think, going to be as interesting as this one. We've got two gentlemen coming in who between them have over a century of experience paddling northern Canada in the Little North area. One of them is Jonathan Berger, who is actually the co-author of a book called Canoe Atlas of the Little North. It's hard to get. I had to wait a year to get a copy. So he's been up there. He spent 64 years up exploring and documenting and mapping and doing those kind of things. The other gentleman is Bill Seeley. He went through and I'm going to mispronounce it because I always do, the Tarragami Canadian Canoe Camp program when he was a kid, and he ended up actually being one of their Hudson Bay guides. What those canoe camps do is they age group kids, and they'll have 10 to 12s, 13 to 14, 15, 16, and then 17, 18. And the 10-year-old, 10, 11-year-olds take wooden canvas boats and wanigans and those kind of things, and they go out for a 2-day, a 3-day, and a 5-day wilderness paddle up in and they're up in Ontario. By the time you get to 17 and 18-year-olds, and this is both, they're sex segregated, but they have identical programs. Those groups do a 7-week paddle from the launch point up to Hudson Bay. They get one resupply during the paddle, and he led those groups. He was one of the guides for those groups, and you can imagine the challenges of taking 8 or 10, 17 to 18-year-old adolescent guys out in the woods and keeping them organized, on track, and bringing them all back alive. I'm sure he's got a lot of stories to tell. So that's February. March is going to be how do you pick a canoe and paddle? We'll be doing that here, using our boats as examples, but going through what do you look for, and what boats might fit your particular paddling profile, and what paddles are good, and how to size a paddle and do those kind of things. Now, for experienced folks, like I suspect most of the folks here are, you might learn a little something, but you can also probably contribute. And for folks who are less familiar, I think we can add some value there. April is a kind of a gear oriented session where we'll talk about kind of the stuff we have on the gear wall and outfitting and those kinds of things. What do you need when you go on canoe trips and that kind of stuff? So that's kind of what the lineup is. Like I said, it's always the third Thursday, and they're all listed on our website in our events area. We're also going to be doing a Novacraft demo day on May 6th. Novacraft is going to be coming down, bringing some boats, and their director of sales, and we think maybe the owner is going to come down and spend a Saturday with us. So that's going to be kind of interesting, and you'll see other things going on as well. If you have any questions, feel free to just reach out to us. We're White Rose Canoe at gmail.com, and the website is White Rose Canoe, so it's easy to find. Okay.
And if you like interesting old wooden canoes, let me recommend the tour of the warehouse. They have some great stuff back there.
Yeah, we've got here in the shop, we've got a 1917 Robertson. We've got a really pristine 1972 16-foot guide. That's the one the build sheet is. That the story there is that the woman who bought it paddled it about 4 times and then decided she wanted to go do whitewater. So she put it up in the barn. And when she passed, her son brought it in. So it's a 1972 boat. It's all original paint, all original wood. It's pristine. It's amazing.
Yeah, right.
And then, like as Benson said, we've got some oldies, not necessarily so goodies in their current shape, back in the warehouse as well. So anyway, so that's who we are. We want to thank you very much for attending. Really appreciate it. Like I said, I think we've got some good stuff coming up, and we do it just because we love canoes and canoers, so we just like to get people together. If you ever just want to swing by, stop in and chat, we're always ready to do that. You know, just one of those things. It's not a hobby. It's something we're doing as a business, but it's just, you know, like they say, if you love what you do, then you're not really working. So it's great. Okay.
Thank you much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time, and we hope to see you soon.